Daniel Carter had always been the kind of man people overlooked at first glance. He was not loud, not flashy, and not the type who walked into a room expecting everyone to notice him. He preferred calm spaces, quiet conversations, and meaningful moments rather than big displays of confidence. At 32, he worked as a graphic designer for a small company in the city. His job allowed him to sit for hours with music in his headphones while he created logos, posters, and digital art. It was peaceful work, and Daniel liked it that way. His life was simple. A modest apartment, a small group of friends, and a routine that rarely changed. For years, he believed that was enough. Then one ordinary afternoon at a bookstore cafe changed everything. It was a rainy Saturday when Daniel first saw Olivia Grant. The cafe inside the bookstore smelled of coffee and old paper. Daniel had stopped there after finishing some errands. He planned to buy a design magazine and sit quietly with a cup of coffee before going home. The cafe was almost full, but he noticed one empty chair near the window. A young woman sat across from it, completely absorbed in a novel. Her brown hair rested loosely on her shoulders, and every few seconds she smiled at something she was reading. That small smile caught Daniel's attention. It looked genuine, the kind of smile that comes from deep inside rather than from politeness. Daniel hesitated for a moment. Talking to strangers had never been easy for him. Still, something about her made him curious. He took a slow breath, walked toward the table, and pointed at the empty chair. "Is this seat taken?" he asked. The woman looked up from her book. Her eyes were warm and curious. "No," she said with a friendly smile. "Go ahead." Daniel sat down and placed his coffee on the table. For a minute they both stayed quiet, each focused on their own things. But Daniel kept noticing her soft laughter while she read. Finally, he couldn't help asking, "Is the book that good?" She closed the book halfway and looked at him. "It depends," she replied playfully. "Do you enjoy stories about people making terrible romantic decisions?" Daniel chuckled. "Sometimes those are the most interesting stories." She laughed again, this time louder. "I'm Olivia," she said. "Daniel." That simple introduction turned into a conversation that lasted 2 hours. They talked about books, movies, favorite places in the city. People develop when they read too much fiction. Olivia worked in marketing for a growing advertising company. She was passionate about storytelling and creative campaigns. Daniel talked about design, colors, and how certain images could make people feel emotions without saying a single word by the time they finished their coffee. The rain outside had stopped. "Do you come here often?" Olivia asked. "Sometimes," Daniel said. "It's peaceful." "Good," she replied with a small smile. "Because I'd like to see you here again." That was the beginning. Over the next few weeks, their casual meetings at the bookstore turned into real dates. They discovered they both loved late-night walks through quiet streets, simple restaurants with warm lighting, and old movies that made them laugh. Olivia had a lively personality that balanced Daniel's calm nature. She enjoyed telling stories, sharing ideas, and exploring new places. Daniel listened carefully and responded with thoughtful comments that made Olivia feel understood. One evening, they sat on a park bench watching the sunset. Olivia turned to him and said something that stayed in Daniel's mind for years. "You know what I like about you?" Daniel looked surprised. "What?" "You don't try to impress people," she said. "You're just real." Daniel didn't know how to respond to that. No one had described him that way before. Their relationship grew naturally. Weekends were spent cooking together in Olivia's small kitchen or watching movies while sharing popcorn on the couch. Sometimes they visited art galleries or quiet parks outside the city. Daniel felt comfortable around her in a way he had never experienced before. Olivia seemed to appreciate his quiet strength and steady support. 3 years passed quickly. During that time, Faye believed he had found the person he would spend his life with. He never imagined that one new person could slowly change the dynamic of their relationship. That person was Victor Hayes. Victor entered Olivia's life when her company hired him as a senior marketing strategist. Olivia first mentioned him during a casual dinner with Daniel one evening. "There's a new guy at work," Jay said while stirring pasta on the stove. Victor Hayes. He just joined our department. Daniel nodded casually. What's he like? Olivia rolled her eyes slightly. Confident. Very confident. Daniel smiled. That doesn't sound too bad. Olivia laughed softly. You haven't met him yet? At first, Victor was simply another coworker in Olivia's stories. She mentioned him occasionally while describing office meetings or work projects. Victor seemed to enjoy being the center of attention at the office. He spoke loudly, told dramatic stories, and often described himself as someone who understood human psychology better than most people. He says he studies leadership behavior. Olivia explained one night. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Does that make him a leader? Olivia shrugged. He definitely believes it does. Weeks passed, and Victor's name started appearing more often in conversations. Olivia would mention things he said during meetings or debates at work. Victor says modern men have lost their confidence. Victor says women naturally respect dominant personalities. Victor says people need to project power. Daniel listened quietly each time. Something about the way Victor talked bothered him. But he didn't want to judge someone he hadn't met. Still, he noticed a subtle change. Olivia seemed both amused and slightly intrigued by Victor's bold personality. One evening, they were sitting on Olivia's balcony drinking tea when she brought him up again. You know what Victor calls himself? She said with a small grin. What? An alpha male. Daniel laughed. Seriously? Very seriously, Olivia replied. He says society needs more strong men. Daniel shook his head with a gentle smile. Confidence is good, he said, but people who call themselves alpha usually try too hard. Olivia looked thoughtful. Maybe. Daniel trusted Olivia completely, so he didn't worry about Victor. To him, Victor sounded like someone who enjoyed hearing his own voice. Nothing more, but slowly, Victor began influencing the atmosphere at Olivia's workplace. His personality attracted attention. Some coworkers admired his confidence. Others found him arrogant but entertaining. Victor often shared his opinions about relationships and personal power during office gatherings. One evening, Olivia told Daniel about a debate that happened during lunch. Victor said women are naturally attracted to dominant men, she explained. While sitting on the couch, and what did you say? Daniel asked. I told him relationships are about respect and trust. Daniel smiled. That sounds more accurate. Olivia leaned back thoughtfully. But he argued that most men today are too passive. Daniel stayed quiet for a moment. Maybe some people confuse kindness with weakness, he said calmly. Olivia looked at him. You're definitely not weak, she said softly. Daniel appreciated the reassurance, but he still felt a strange feeling in his chest. Not jealousy, but curiosity. Who was this man who spoke so confidently about everyone else's relationships? Eventually, the opportunity to meet Victor arrived. One Friday afternoon, Olivia called Daniel. My office team is going out to dinner tonight, she said. It's just a casual thing after work. Would you like to come? Daniel agreed. He thought it would be nice to meet the people Olivia worked with every day. The restaurant they chose was a modern place, downtown with warm lighting and lively music. Daniel arrived a few minutes early and waited near the table Olivia had reserved for her coworkers. He felt relaxed, expecting a normal evening of friendly conversation. Soon Olivia arrived and greeted him with a hug. I'm glad you came, Jay said. One by one, her coworkers started arriving. They were friendly and welcoming, asking Daniel questions about his work and joking about office stories. Then the atmosphere shifted slightly when Victor walked in. Daniel noticed him immediately. Victor was tall, well-dressed, and carried himself with confident energy. His posture suggested he was used to being the most noticeable person in the room. When Olivia introduced them, Victor looked Daniel up and down with a measuring expression. So, you're Daniel? Victor said. That's right, Daniel replied politely. Victor shook his hand firmly. I've heard a lot about you. Something about the tone felt unusual, but Daniel ignored it. Nice to meet you. Daniel said calmly. Victor sat down across from him and leaned back in his chair with relaxed confidence. Olivia says you're a nice guy. The phrase sounded slightly sarcastic, but Daniel simply smiled. I try to be. Throughout dinner, Victor dominated the conversation. He told stories about business deals, personal achievements, and his philosophy about life. Several coworkers listened with interest while others seemed quietly amused. Daniel mostly listened. He didn't feel the need to compete for attention, but Victor kept glancing at him occasionally. As if studying him, at one point, Victor started talking about relationships. The problem today, he said loudly, is that many men don't know how to lead. Some coworkers looked uncomfortable. Leadership is about presence, Victor continued. Women respect strong personalities. Daniel sipped his drink quietly. Trying not to react, Victor leaned forward slightly. Some men are naturally dominant, he added. Others are just agreeable. His eyes shifted toward Daniel. The table became quiet. The moment Daniel looked directly at Victor, something subtle changed at the table. The noise of the restaurant continued around them, plates clinking. People laughing, music playing softly, but the small group sitting at Olivia's table suddenly felt quiet and tense. Victor leaned back in his chair with an easy smile. The kind of smile people used when they believed they were completely in control of a situation. Daniel remained calm. His face showed no anger, but inside he felt a new kind of awareness growing. For years he had ignored people like Victor. Tonight, however, he could clearly see what was happening. Victor was trying to measure him, test him, and quietly place himself above him. Olivia noticed it too. She shifted slightly in her seat and gave Victor a warning look, but Victor either didn't notice or didn't care. He picked up his glass, took a slow drink, and continued speaking as if the entire table existed to hear his opinions. You see, Victor said, resting his elbow on the table. Confidence is everything. A man should walk into a room and own it. People should feel his presence immediately. Some of Olivia's coworkers nodded politely. Others looked at their menus or their phones, clearly unsure how to respond. Victor loved an audience, and even awkward silence worked in his favor because it meant everyone was listening. Daniel stayed quiet, observing. He had met many confident people in his life, but Victor's confidence felt different. It wasn't natural or calm. It was loud, like someone constantly trying to prove something. Victor turned his attention back to Daniel. So Daniel, he said casually, what kind of work did you say you do again? I'm a graphic designer, Daniel answered. Victor nodded slowly. Creative field, interesting. Daniel could already sense where the conversation was going. Victor looked around the table as if preparing for a performance. Creative people usually think differently, Victor continued. They're more relaxed, more emotionally. The way he said emotional sounded like an insult disguised as observation. Daniel kept his tone calm. Creativity requires patience, said. Victor smirked. Patience is good, but leadership is better. Olivia sighed quietly. Victor, she said, we're here to relax, not debate philosophy. Victor raised his hands playfully. I'm just talking. But the way he kept glancing at Daniel showed that he wasn't just talking. He was testing limits. Food arrived at the table, giving everyone a short break from the tension. People focused on their plates and small conversations started again. For a few minutes, the atmosphere returned to normal. Daniel even thought the awkward moment had passed. Then Victor spoke again. You know something funny? He said, pointing his fork slightly as he talked. In my experience, women always say they like nice guys. Daniel felt Olivia glance at him. Victor continued. But when it comes to real attraction, they usually go for confident men. The comment hung in the air like a challenge. One of Olivia's coworkers, a man named Ethan, cleared his throat. I think it depends on the person, he said. Victor shook his head confidently. No, it's biology. Humans are wired for strength. Daniel slowly placed his fork down. His patience was still strong. But Victor's constant need to prove dominance was becoming exhausting. Victor looked directly at Daniel again. Don't you agree? Daniel wiped his hands with a napkin and spoke calmly. I think relationships are more complicated than that. Victor smiled as if Daniel had just stepped into a trap. Oh, really? Daniel nodded. People connect for many reasons. Respect, trust, shared values. Victor leaned forward slightly. That sounds very idealistic. Maybe, Daniel replied. But it works. Victor chuckled. You know what the problem with idealistic thinking is? Daniel waited. It ignores reality. Olivia placed her fork down. Victor, that's enough. But Victor continued as if he hadn't heard her. In reality, he said, strong personalities lead. Weak ones follow. Several people at the table exchanged uncomfortable looks. Daniel took a slow breath. His natural instinct was still to avoid confrontation, but something about Victor's behavior made that impossible now. Victor wasn't simply sharing opinions anymore. He was deliberately pushing boundaries. Daniel leaned slightly forward. Why do you care so much about being the strongest person in the room? He asked calmly. Victor raised an eyebrow. Because that's how you gain respect. Daniel studied him quietly. Respect isn't something you demand. Victor smiled again. But this time the smile looked tighter. Sometimes you have to. Daniel shook his head gently. Real respect happens naturally. The conversation had completely captured the table's attention now. No one was eating anymore. Everyone was listening. Victor crossed his arms. Let me guess, he said. You believe everyone should just get along and be kind. Daniel smiled slightly. Kindness isn't weakness. Victor laughed. That's exactly what weak men say. Livia looked embarrassed. Victor. But Daniel raised a hand slightly to show he was fine. For a moment he considered staying quiet again, letting the conversation end naturally. That had always been his usual choice in situations like this. But something inside him told him that silence would only encourage Victor to continue. Daniel spoke calmly. You keep talking about alpha males, Victor nodded proudly, because they exist. Daniel tilted his head. Slightly. What makes someone an alpha in your opinion? Victor answered immediately. Dominance, confidence, control. Daniel thought for a moment. Then he asked another question. Do you believe confident people need to remind others that they're confident? Victor frowned slightly. What do you mean? Daniel remained relaxed. You've mentioned being an alpha several times tonight. A few coworkers looked down, hiding smiles. Victor leaned forward and Daniel shrugged lightly. People who are truly confident usually don't need to announce it. The words landed quietly, but powerfully. Victor's expression changed. His smile faded for the first time that evening. You think I'm announcing it? He asked. Daniel nodded calmly, a little. Victor laughed loudly, but the laugh sounded forced. That's funny. Daniel continued. Confidence is quiet. Ego is loud. The table went completely silent. Olivia looked at Daniel with surprise. She had never heard him speak this directly before. Victor stared at him. So now you're analyzing me? Daniel shook his head. No. Just sharing an observation. Victor leaned closer. You think you're better than me? Daniel answered without hesitation. No. Victor looked confused. Then what are you saying? Daniel took a sip of water before responding. I think we see the world differently. Victor's eyes narrowed. And you think your way is right? Daniel shrugged. It works for me. Victor looked around the table, clearly expecting someone to support him. But no one spoke. That silence irritated him. Let me ask you something, Victor said. Go ahead. Daniel replied. If Olivia had to choose between a man who dominates the room and a man who sits quietly, who do you think she would respect more? The question was direct and uncomfortable. Olivia immediately spoke. That's not fair. But Daniel answered. Before she could continue, she doesn't have to choose, he said calmly. Victor smirked. Why not? Daniel looked directly at him because Relationships aren't competitions. Victor laughed again. Everything in life is competition. Daniel shook his head. Not love. The simple answer made. Victor paused. Daniel continued quietly. Love isn't about proving you're stronger than someone else. It's about supporting the person you care about. Victor leaned back in his chair, studying him carefully now for the first time. He wasn't completely sure how to respond. Daniel added one more sentence. If Olivia ever feels happier with someone else, she's free to make that choice. Olivia turned toward him with surprise. But I trust her. Victor blinked. That response completely disrupted his expectations. He had expected jealousy, anger, or insecurity. Instead, Daniel showed something Victor didn't know how to challenge: calm confidence. One of the coworkers finally spoke. Honestly, that sounds pretty mature. Another person nodded. Victor suddenly realized something uncomfortable. The conversation had shifted away from him. For most of the evening, he had been the center of attention. But now the room felt different. People were looking at Daniel with quiet respect. Victor forced a smile. Well, he said, standing slightly from his chair, this has been an interesting conversation. Daniel simply nodded. Victor picked up his jacket. I think I'll get some air. As he walked away from the table, the tension slowly dissolved. Ethan leaned closer to Daniel. That was impressive. He whispered. Daniel looked confused. I didn't do anything. Olivia smiled softly, watching him. But in her eyes, something had changed. For years, she had seen Daniel as gentle, kind, and calm. Tonight, she realized he was something more. He wasn't quiet because he was weak. He was quiet because he didn't need to prove himself, and without raising his voice once. Daniel had just taken control of a situation that Victor believed belonged to him. Victor stood outside the restaurant, staring through the glass window at the table inside. He hated what he saw. Daniel laughing calmly with the group, and Olivia looking at him with admiration. Victor had been trying to earn all night. For the first time in a long time, Victor Hayes felt something unfamiliar. He had walked into that dinner expecting to dominate the room. Instead, a quiet man had taken away his spotlight without even trying, and Victor realized something that made his jaw tighten. The real competition had only just begun. The drive home was quiet, yet heavy with a kind of tension that neither Olivia nor Daniel could ignore. Streetlights glided past their car windows, casting long streaks of gold and white across the seats. The city outside hummed faintly with nightlife cars honking in the distance. Muffled conversations from pedestrians. The faint thrum of music leaking from shops, but inside the car, time seemed to slow. Daniel sat in the passenger seat, calm as ever. But there was a new weight in his chest. A mixture of clarity and relief that he hadn't felt before. For years, he had avoided confrontation, believing silence was strength. He had practiced patience, had always chosen the path of least resistance, and had trusted in quiet consistency. But tonight, everything had shifted. Victor Hayes, the man who thrived on attention, loudness, and domination, had been challenged in the gentlest way possible. And Daniel had done it without yelling, without confrontation, without losing his composure. Olivia drove slowly, one hand on the wheel, the other tapping absent-mindedly on her thigh. She glanced at Daniel, her brown eyes soft and filled with emotions she hadn't expressed before. I'm sorry, she said quietly, breaking the silence. Daniel turned slightly toward her. For what? He asked. For Victor, she admitted, her voice almost trembling. He can be overwhelming sometimes. I didn't mean for him to make things awkward for you. Daniel nodded slowly, understanding. He's confident, he said simply. Olivia sighed and shook her head. That's one way to put it, she replied. There was a pause. Then she looked straight at him. I didn't expect you to say what you did tonight. Daniel smiled faintly. Neither did I, he admitted. The air between them was heavy, not with tension, but with realization. For years, Daniel had worried about being too quiet, too patient, too gentle. Olivia had noticed it too, but she had loved him nonetheless. Tonight, however, had been a revelation for both of them. Daniel had always believed that patience and calmness were virtues, that kindness was strength, but he had rarely tested his limits. Victor had unknowingly forced him to speak, to stand firm, and to demonstrate a kind of confidence that did not demand admiration but earned it naturally. Daniel had spoken not to dominate, not to boast, but simply to be himself. That authenticity had transformed the room, shifting the energy in ways Victor could not understand and Olivia had never anticipated. And now, as the car glided past quiet streets, that realization settled deeply in Daniel's chest. Olivia reached over and lightly touched Daniel's arm. "Were you angry?" she asked softly, almost whispering. Daniel looked out the window for a moment, the reflection of the streetlights creating fleeting shadows across his face. "A little," he admitted, "but not at him. Not really. It wasn't about anger." Olivia tilted her head, curious and attentive. "Then why?" she asked. Daniel exhaled slowly, his eyes never leaving the blur of lights outside. "Because I realized I had been trying too hard to be the nice guy." Olivia frowned slightly, confused. "But you are nice." Daniel smiled faintly. "Being kind is good," he said gently. "But being quiet all the time, letting others take the stage, isn't always the right choice. Confidence doesn't have to be loud. It doesn't have to dominate, but it has to exist." He paused, then added, "Tonight, I just decided to let myself speak." Olivia studied him, realization dawning in her eyes. "You mean all those times you stayed quiet? It wasn't weakness." Daniel shook his head. "Not at all." The car continued its slow journey through the city, the hum of the engine blending with the soft night sounds outside. Olivia's voice broke the silence again. "I was worried," she admitted. "Sometimes I wondered if you were too passive, too quiet for me." Daniel turned to her, his expression gentle. "And now, cast." Olivia smiled softly, her eyes reflecting the streetlights and something deeper admiration, relief, and a newfound respect. "Now I see you differently," she said. "You didn't need to dominate. You didn't need to prove anything. You just were yourself." Daniel felt a warmth spread in his chest. For so long, he had feared that being quiet and kind might not be enough. Tonight, he learned that being genuine, standing calmly for what he believed in and trusting both himself and Olivia, was stronger than any loud demonstration of ego. They pulled up near Daniel's apartment building, the quiet street bathed in the soft glow of lamps. Olivia slowed the car to a stop. She turned to Daniel, her eyes serious yet soft. "You know," she began, "Victor talks about confidence as if it's all about control, about showing off. But you showed me something very different tonight." Daniel gave a small, humble smile. "I didn't do it to show off," he said. "I did it because I realized that the quiet way isn't the weak way. Sometimes speaking calmly and standing your ground is louder than yelling or dominating a room." Olivia's expression softened. She reached over and lightly touched his hand. "You were right," she said quietly. "It's not about being louder. It's about being real." Daniel felt a deep sense of relief wash over him. He hadn't needed to perform. He hadn't needed validation. Just being himself had been enough. Before Daniel stepped out of the car, he paused. The night air was cool against his skin, and the city lights reflected off the nearby buildings. He looked at Olivia, her eyes watching him closely. "You know something funny?" he asked with a faint smile. Olivia tilted her head. "What?" Daniel's smile widened slightly. "I still don't know what an alpha male really is." Olivia laughed softly, a sound that made Daniel's chest tighten with a gentle warmth. "Maybe," she said, "it's not about Victor's version. Maybe it's about people who don't need to prove themselves constantly." Daniel nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her words. "Exactly," he said. "It's about quiet strength." Olivia smiled and shook her head slightly, amused. "You're full of surprises," she said. Daniel stepped out of the car and walked toward his apartment building. Each step felt lighter than it had in years. The tension, the doubts, the fear of not being enough all of it seemed to dissolve with every step. He realized something profound. He had never needed to fight to prove his worth. Being genuine, being honest, and speaking calmly when it mattered was more powerful than any loud argument or display of dominance. Tonight, he had discovered his own strength. Olivia remained in the car for a moment, watching him walk away. Her heart swelled with something new, a deep admiration and a quiet awe for the man she had always loved but never truly seen in this light, Victor Hayes. Standing outside the restaurant earlier, had no idea what had happened. He had believed confidence was about domination and performance, about showing the world who was strongest. He had underestimated Daniel completely. And now Daniel had done what Victor couldn't. He had won respect without raising his voice, without boasting, without performing at all. That quiet, genuine confidence had shifted the energy of the entire room, changed Olivia's perception, and left Victor feeling powerless in a way he had never experienced. It was a subtle victory, but an absolute one. Daniel climbed the steps to his apartment and paused at the door. He looked back briefly at the street, at the glow of the lamps, and felt a sense of completeness. He hadn't needed to dominate, to boast, or to demand attention. He had simply been himself, spoken his truth, and trusted the bond he shared with Olivia. And that trust, that honesty, had created a kind of power that no one could challenge. As he entered his apartment, he felt a calm sense of victory settle in his chest. Tonight had been a revelation. It wasn't about being loud. It wasn't about being the alpha. It was about being real, being honest, and being the person Olivia loved, not through performance, but through authenticity. Olivia finally drove away, leaving Daniel's apartment behind her. Her mind was still replaying the evening, the calm way Daniel had responded, the quiet strength he had shown. She realized something she hadn't admitted before. The man she had loved for years had depths she had never truly seen. Daniel's quiet confidence, the way he spoke without needing to dominate, had revealed a new layer of strength, one that no loud words or exaggerated posturing could ever match. She smiled softly to herself, knowing that tonight had changed everything, not just for Victor, but for both of them. And Daniel, standing inside his apartment, felt the same calm certainty. Love, he realized, was never about showing strength. It was about living it quietly, faithfully, and honestly. Tonight had been the first night Daniel truly understood that. And that understanding, more than anything, made him feel free.